looking at the divine Messiah in Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, just overviewing some of these titles named of the one who would be given, the coming Messiah, and looking at whether or not the Old Testament expected a divine Messiah, comes this well-known verse, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. And there will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. I'm going to take a look at some of these titles named here, because it talks about the idea of a child being born, son being given. And this really, there are several titles here, but the idea of someone being given, or the son being given, and this projects forward toward the New Testament as well. But I think it also looks back to the beginning of the Old Testament, where it talks about the seed of the woman. But let's highlight that first word, son. Son will be given. Adam is called the son of God. Seth, Adam's son, is called son of God, in the sense that they were created in God's image, have an obligation to represent God. Israel is also supposed to take over the role of man, the role of Adam as the son of God. In fact, Exodus 4:22, Moses speaking to Pharaoh, the Lord speaking to Pharaoh actually through Moses, talks about Israel, and God says, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Now, this is important because this means that this son who's going to be given will embody Israel. In fact, Israel fails in its mandate to act as God's son and God's servant. And Isaiah says that this will be brought about by the Messiah, who will actually be able to personify and embody Israel. It talks about this in Isaiah 49, where it actually calls him true Israel, and says that he as an individual will bring the sons of Jacob back to the Lord their God. So Israel is called a son. David and the Davidic kings are also called sons. 2 Samuel 7, I think this is applicable here because it talks about on the throne of David and over his kingdom is where this son who is born is going to reign. But 2 Samuel 7, when David is given the Davidic covenant, and he said that God says that everyone in David's line will be a son to him, and God will be a father to them. This is kind of unique relationship, God to the king and the king's role in Israel and in the world. Psalm 2 also talks about the installment of God's son, the Davidic king, and David's looking forward ahead to this ultimate Davidic king, the Messiah, where God says, today you are my son, today I have begotten you. There's this relationship of the king, the Davidic king, the Messiah, to God. But also the end of the psalm, in Psalm 2:12, ends with the nations being warned to worship the Son, to bow toward the Son, to kiss toward the Son, that everyone who does not will perish, and that everyone who takes refuge in him is blessed. This is God's true Son that is able to receive even worship from the nations as an expression of God's glory. This is his son, and I think this is leading forward to ultimately the existential Son of God, meaning that Christians, believers, are called sons of God. Israel is called son of God. David's called son of God. But believers are called sons of God. But we are sons of God by grace. But ultimately, the Messiah, the true Son of God, is revealed to be the existential Son of God, the Son of God who shares the same divine nature as God. And that God gives his Son, sends his Son into the world. I think the most famous verse in the New Testament, John 3:16, which parallels Psalm 2:12 talks about God sending his only begotten son. A son will be given to us. So this child will be born. And I think this whole phrase, son will be given to us, a child will be born, is looking forward to the ultimate eschatological fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14, where it talks about the virgin conceiving and giving birth to a son, calling his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. The son will also have the right to rule God's behalf as God's son. And he's going to be born as human nature. Government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called. Now, this section here, and his name will be called, these aren't just titles as if people just throw sometimes names out there that don't have any relationship to someone's actual being or nature. This phrase more communicates the idea of this person will be called this because these titles are indicative of this individual's nature. So the first one here is Wonderful Counselor. Sometimes they separate these two out as he will be called Wonderful and Counselor, but it seems like all these titles seem to go together, like they all have and kind of in English at least, an adjective that goes with them. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. So, Wonderful Counselor, person has God's counsel, God's wisdom, the ultimate expression of all of the embodiment of God's wisdom. And I think this is not that others can share wisdom as well. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But I think this is referring to a divine attribute said later of the suffering servant, that he will act wisely. But also this wisdom is seen to be, or counsel is seen to be, an attribute of God. In Isaiah 28:29 says, this also comes from the Lord of hosts, who has made his counsel wonderful and his wisdom great. So see there that those ideas are tied into God's nature, and that this son to be born, who will be a Davidic king, will in some way be the embodiment of God's divine wisdom. We also see in Isaiah 40, Isaiah's great series of questions, talking about Isaiah 40:13, who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or who as his counselor has informed him. I mean, God has need and no counsel in his wisdom, but this one is the one who is the embodiment of God's wisdom, Wonderful Counselor, that, as Colossians 2 talks about, that all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are hidden in Jesus Christ. And so this is a divine attribute of the Messiah, that he will be wisdom embodied. And if we think of Solomon's influence and content as he contributes to Scripture in writing in the wisdom literature, that ultimately Solomon's greater heir, the Messiah, will be the embodiment of divine wisdom, because he will be equal in nature to God himself. Also be called Mighty God. So this is a title talking about God's might, the Almighty One, titled Genesis 17:1 and other places, but is called Mighty God. Now, there are places in the scriptures where other people are called gods. Sometimes kings are called gods, or things of that nature. So that this term God does not always refer to God's essential being. Here, I believe that it does, that this king is called Mighty God. Now, is there other precedent for this in the Old Testament, that this human king is being called Mighty God? Well, listen to Psalm 45, this psalm for the king. It's sometimes called the song for the marriage supper of the king. But it talks about in Psalm 45:3, it says, "Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and majesty." So there's that idea of the mighty, the same word. But then God himself speaks to the king and says, "Your throne, O God, Elohim, O God." So mighty, Psalm 45:3, "Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one." And then Psalm 45:6, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom, to rule in righteousness from then on forevermore. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows." Hebrews 1 quotes this, referring of God speaking ultimately to the Messiah, appropriately calling him mighty God while still preserving that distinction. God speaks to this one. Your throne, O God, is for ever and ever. Verse 7, therefore God, your God, has anointed you. So this is someone who shared divine status and nature with God and divine identity with God. However, the distinction is preserved, that there is personality within being who is God. So the Messiah will also be called mighty God. I think Isaiah bears that out if he talks about the exaltation of the suffering servant who will be high and lifted up, just as God on the throne, the Lord on the throne, was high and lifted up, lofty and exalted in Isaiah 6:1. And I think that what the servant accomplishes as a man earns him as a human being the right to be called mighty God, even though he existed with God eternally. Now, where do we get that? Well, next title here, Eternal Father. Now, some people get tripped up by this and they say, well, wait a second. Is this a blurring of the distinction? Is this saying Jesus is God the Father? We need to step out of those helpful but sometimes clouding Trinitarian distinctions. I think they're important to preserve theologically. We want to be careful biblically to make sure that those distinctions are accurate in what the Bible is teaching, and I believe that they are. However, Eternal Father is not saying Jesus is the same as God the Father. They are the same as far as nature, but they are distinguished in person. But what this really means is Father of eternity. This is one who has eternal existence, has transcendent existence with God. Eternal Father, Father of eternity. Micah 5:2 talks about this as well. The one who will be born in Bethlehem, this ruler, the shepherd. His goings forth are from the days of eternity, from ancient times, the days of eternity. Habakkuk 1:2 uses the same word for talking about the eternal God and God's attribute of eternality, that because he is the eternally existent, transcendent creator God, dependent on nothing, that he is eternal. And that this child is going to be born. Yes, there is a point in time in which he is born. However, he is also the Father of eternity. A tension is introduced between this human and divine nature that can only be resolved in the incarnation of God himself. And then he's called the Prince of Peace, that he is the one who will bring in true peace, lasting peace. He will make peace between God and man. He will be a ruler over an eternal throne, an eternal kingdom. There will not be an end to the increase of his government or peace, and he is a descendant of David. He will reign on the throne of David and over his kingdom. And that this will be accomplished by the zeal of the Lord of hosts. Now, does this anticipate a divine Messiah? I believe that it does. I think that these terms here, especially in this case, mighty God, but also wonderful counselor and eternal Father, Father of eternity, indicate very clearly the divinity of a Messiah. Now, how that would be worked out and the tension that's introduced here, I think, is only resolved with further revelation in the person and the coming of Jesus Christ, who is the Son given for us, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life.